Hi, Robin. Welcome to Data Storytime. How are you doing today?
Good, Catherine. How are you?
I am very good. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I know you've got a whole set of stories to tell me on today's episode. But before we do that, tell me a little bit about your current role and your career leading up to this point.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know me, Robin Sutara, I'm currently a field CTO at Databricks. Despite the accent, I am based out of London. I'm responsible for all of Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I joined Databricks about 9 months ago now, so primarily focused on how can we take some of these lessons learned, et cetera, for throughout my career and help organizations as they're thinking about true, proper lakehouse implementation, tying together their data sets. How do they sort of unlock the power of their data? I think the company realized that it wasn't all about technology. There was also some aspects of people and process around that. So one of the reasons that they had I sort of came over was prior to joining Databricks, I spent 23 years with Microsoft and helped them go on their digital and data transformation in various roles. The last two were really focused on people and process and going through that transformation as the chief data officer for Microsoft UK, which is what brought me to London. And prior to that, as the COO for Azure Data Engineering, which is all of the products that Microsoft sells around the data space. And so yeah, it's been a pretty eclectic career, sort of leading up to where I am now, but really enjoying getting to spend time with everybody in this community listening to the podcast on, what lessons have I learned in trying to do big digital complex data transformations? And not that I have all the answers, but more than happy to collaborate, I think, with the community on those things.
I think what's so funny for me to hear, Robin, is obviously I speak to people from all sorts of organizations, but to hear about Microsoft and Databricks kind of going through these digital transformations, I think from the outside, we just take for granted that those transformations are ongoing in these kind of tech-based companies as well. You talk to banks and retailers, you expect that conversation, but actually it's quite refreshing to hear that obviously there's intention behind like Microsoft, Databricks, etc., doing that as well. And it just provides a bit of a different perspective, I think. So you want to tell me a story about the complexity of organization transformation. Set the scene for me. What are the top big challenges that face an organization when they are in that throw of transforming?
Yeah, I think the one that always gets overlooked, and yet we've talked about it for decades, is really the people. So if you think about things like ProSci, et cetera, they all created sort of these change managements. How do you take change management structures and frameworks? How do you take people on a transformation journey? And yet what happens is we tend to focus on technology. And maybe I have that perspective because I've always been at a tech company. But people always sort of say, oh, there's this cool new technology, or look at this user interface, or here's a new tool. And this is automatically going to make everybody in the organization align with the change and come use these things and change the way that they fundamentally do business. But if you think about it, even look at yourself, I would recommend, like, if I look at myself, oh my gosh, sometimes to change my habits are horrible, right? It just takes me really consciously thinking about it and being very deliberate. And so you have to think about when you're taking a complex org on a transformation like that, it's the same thing. It's how do you think about reiteration? How do you think about communication strategy? How do you think about the different ways that it'll be received? Particularly, for example, when I was in that COO role, a group of multiple thousand engineers, and every single one of them I felt like needed a different communication method. Some of them wanted email, some of them wanted an all hands to be verbally communicated to, some wanted hands-on sort of training and capabilities. And so right, I think when you think about really complex, make sure you put the people at the center of that, and then you start thinking about, okay, how are the people in the organization being blocked as we try to get to that next level of transformation? That helps you start thinking about prioritization of processes, where the technical gaps may be, et cetera. So I would really recommend putting people at the center of your transformation and then start to build your plan based on that.
Yeah. I love the encouragement to think about yourself and the changes you go through, because reminds me of when people download a running app and they think this is going to help my fitness journey, but actually that's just a tool in which you can, you know, collect the data and it links to your Fitbit, etc. That's not actually going to make a difference to your fitness, let's be honest. It's actually doing the work behind that. It's bringing in that cultural change of getting up at 5 a.m. and going for a run. And I think that's such a great way of thinking about it, thinking about your own changes as you encouraged, because the technology piece, I think, is probably the easiest part for many organizations. I mean, obviously you have to go out and get the budget and the buy-in from the executives to bring it in-house. I understand those challenges, but in terms of finding the tech out there, I mean, you just have to go to any, you know, exhibition in a conference and see all the tech providers. We're not you know, in a land of not finding the right people for that. But as you say, it's that people and process element that goes into making sure that tech is being well used.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm going to put you in the position of when you've kind of been parachuted into these organizations, you've got all these challenges, you know you have to deal with people, and as you mentioned there, you've got people that want to communicate in different methods, where they are on their journey to understanding this. What's some of the first things that you would suggest of really taking on board in those first initial steps, days, months, weeks, to make a start on this journey?
Yeah, I think a few things that I learned in going through, and let me just iterate that this was not something that I instantaneously created. There were a lot of failures to get to this point. I think for me, the very first thing is just listening, right? Because you always sort of go into a role and think, I've done a transformation before. I understand how this works. I know where we're getting to. I have executive buy-in to, right? Because that's why they brought you in that role and that function. At least in some capacity, you have executive buy-in. That's all probably a whole other podcast to talk about the complexities of true buy-in. But I think for me, the very first thing is listen, right? Listen to the organization, understand where they came from. When I came into that COO role, it was really interesting because I sort of made some assumptions, like the system of record was really what everybody believed to be the system of record and the one source of truth. And right, so I tried to implement, for example, a change around how we were going to manage space allocation for the teams based on what I thought was the system of record, and immediately met with resistance across the organization because I hadn't sat with them to understand what were some of the idiosyncrasies, why, right, the quality of the data in the system. And so for me, that really opened up a two-way communication with the leaders across the organization to start to think about, okay, if the system of truth isn't meeting the needs because of the quality of the data, which ultimate leader you're responsible for, right, it really starts to open up sort of the whole process, iteration, feedback loop communication across those different leaders to say, right, thank you. I understand where you're coming from. I understand the discipline that goes into that, the complexities of using the tools and the systems. And so how can we make it easier? And at the same token, how do we make sure that we're being data driven in our decisioning and start to use it as the system of record and really ground that as being our source of truth? And so it was a much better way to approach it as opposed to the first time where I think they wanted to throw me out of the room and lock the door because I had just by default assumed that everybody, thought that was really the source of truth and that we could make decisions based on it.
I love that answer, and thank you for being so candid with that, because I think that these episodes, these story times, I think are the best they can be when people speak from when things have gone perhaps not quite to plan versus, you know, the successes as well. And I think what you're saying there around the assumptions of especially as you have a track record, right? You did what you do in your career, so you go, I know how to do this. Actually having that humble moment to go, well, hang on, I need to, before I go in and do all the things that I'm excellent at doing, I do need to understand the foundation that I'm coming in at. And I think that's really, really interesting. And probably, I think there'll probably be a lot of CDOs and data leaders who are watching this and nodding along thinking, yeah, I've done the same. So yeah, really, really interesting. Now, you mentioned earlier about the change management piece. What's the lessons learned when it comes to bringing people on this journey with you and making sure you are constantly listening and have that feedback loop? What are some of the lessons learned there for you?
Yeah, I think I'll fall back to the right, making sure that you're grounding on the people that you're trying to drive through the change. I think we had a leadership team of 12 VPs that we were trying, because each one was responsible for a different component or piece of the business, and trying to get them all to the table to articulate in the same way. It was definitely an adventure, right? If I think about even looking at getting them to align on how they were going to approach specific products, or how we were going to, deliver the best experience to a customer on how the products would work together, much less how were we going to drive internally the business and sort of bring them along on the journey. And so each one of them, I think I almost felt like I was driving 12 separate work streams with these leaders to say, okay, this leader likes to communicate in this way, and he wants direct communication with his team, and he wants the capability to give feedback. She doesn't want that, right? It's relative, her schedule's relatively busy. She would much prefer sort of this approach. And so one of the foundational things that we really started at the very beginning was setting out the principles and the guidelines that we were going to use. And so that everybody, at least at that high level, was aligned on these are the principles that we're going to apply in the business, and how we're going to use the data, and why everyone needs to, however we get there via your changes for your organization, this is ultimately the goal and where we need to get to. And once we had that buy-in, it became much easier to sort of navigate, who needed extra readiness, who needed better communication strategies, who needed a little more hand holding as they were looking to take their organization along on that journey, who didn't have the right resources in place. Some of them had invested in sort of data analysts within their business, and so they really had a better grasp of what was going on, versus others where we needed to think about what were the services that my team could provide to them to be able to do that. And so I think we definitely had a harmonized mesh sort of environment, organizational design going on as we thought about how do we aggregate that by grounding everybody and getting executive buy-in across all of those leaders and all of those executives, that these were the principles that we were going to drive, and then in determining what was the change management strategy we were going to take for each one of those organizations, what were we going to provide at a centralized level to support that, and then what supports, right, that they were going to provide or deliver to get their organizations along on that journey. And so I think the good part was it was definitely eye-opening for me to see the different approaches that these leaders would sort of take in that change management process. But by making sure that we had the fundamentals and the foundations and the principles all the same and aligned, it was much easier to aggregate into a single plan to ultimately drive the outcome.
Yeah, when I've spoken to people before, Robin, about transformation, something that comes up time and time again is data storytelling, and really kind of using data in a very thoughtful way, and allowing that change to happen because people are engaged with that story. They're engaged with the business value behind that. Where does data storytelling sit for you in all of this?
I think it sits at every level, right? So you have to ensure that from the top down, you're demonstrating and telling stories around the value that data is bringing to the business. But you also need the bottom up. I think most of the innovation actually happens grassroots efforts. And so making sure that you have forums and ways that people can tell their stories, their successes, what they've been able to achieve, because I do, right, that's the technology company background. They want to share innovation. Oh my gosh, they love to share what they've come up with and how they've created and how they're using data and insights from customers to transform our product roadmap. And so ensuring, again, I think that ties into your communication plan to how are you creating the platform? Is it aggregated with the all up goals and objectives of the organization? If the story is disparate from what you're trying to achieve as your final end. And so it becomes like a concentrated effort on how do you integrate all of those capabilities for various levels of the organization to storytell at the right moment and the right capacity to be able to get the rest of the organization excited around what you're trying to do and where you're looking to go.
It's such a fresh perspective, because very much whenever I'm talking about data storytelling with folk like yourself, it is always kind of from that perspective of top down. But actually, as you say, it does make sense that especially people at the grassroots level, at the technical level, they do want to show off, and they are, experimenting, and hopefully, organizations should be aiming for a culture where there is a certain amount of time set aside for these technical folk to be playing around with data and to be experimenting rather than just doing the kind of day-to-day. And as you say, it's about creating that feedback loop that they can then show what they're doing. And I think that the disconnect, I think, for many organizations is that there can be an issue where the technical folk perhaps don't know the business well enough to be able to tell those stories, to say how it's going to impact it. And I think that's something that a lot of leaders are now working through, of how do we connect both business and technical together so that the business knows to ask the right questions of the technical team, but the technical team also know to pass the information forward that says, this is going to be a return of investment, this is going to change the bottom line, this is how we drive more revenue. There's a disconnect there for many organizations. I feel. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we overlook the technical capabilities that the business has, right? And so we always sort of default back to the technical team, whereas if you bring them along on the journey, and whether that means you physically, align your data team within the business groups and their dotted line into a central function or vice versa. I think when you have the technical capabilities of the business group trying to solve these problems, because again, they will be the ones who innovate on how to use data to take the organization to the next level of transformation, by ensuring that there is a feedback loop for them and you're being agile about and listening and changing. Because lots of the organizations I talk to today, if you talk to the business, they feel like the technical teams and the IT teams are blocking them from innovation and moving quicker and being transformative. And if you talk to the IT teams, they're trying to put the rigor and the structure and the compliance and the risk mitigation. And so there's complexities on both sides. And so I think by making sure that you're leveraging that technical capability aligned with the tech team so that it's more of a collaborative, how fast can you innovate as a result? I have to say, I'm amazed at the rate of innovation, for example, at Databricks, just based on sitting with customers, understanding the complexities that they're going through, where's the product delimitation, and taking it from a business perspective as well as an IT perspective to think about how do we at Databricks iterate on our product roadmap. So Dolly's a great example of that, right? Like in 2 weeks, we literally created an open source Q&A bank for people to be able to leverage, that was actually didn't have the same restrictions and limitations, trying to mitigate the risk that we saw at Samsung, et cetera. So I think, sorry, now I'm dating the podcast a little bit, but I think it's just amazing what we can do when we tie the components together and make sure that it is a give and take. We're being agile. It's a feedback loop across the two of them. And I think that just opens up a massive rate of innovation and transformation in an organization.
On that point about agility, obviously we see so much of it. There's discussion around an agile methodology. Do you think it's possible for larger organizations, I'm thinking, the big enterprises, to be agile in this approach? Because I think there's often discourse that it's kind of the younger startup, digitally native organizations that manage to adopt kind of the agile methodology easier or perhaps more effectively. Do you think it's something that the bigger enterprise companies can also do?
I think so, but I would be remiss to not say there's politics and process and procedure. I mean, gosh, Microsoft is how old? We definitely had existing ecosystems that you have to navigate, which is super helpful when you have 20 years, not as helpful if you're coming in as a new leader to try to navigate those. And so I think my recommendation would be to try to be agile in those things where you're going to meet the least amount of resistance to show the value of that type of process and capability, which then opens up, again, I think this comes in where you get the grassroots efforts meet the top-down sort of approach, because if your leaders start to see from the people in the organization how they're being agile, how they're capable of giving feedback, how things are going to change relatively quickly to unlock more business, to unlock better customer experiences, to deliver new services, net new money, revenue streams, I think right then you start to really remove some of those existing ecosystem blockers that may exist in a more legacy organization. Not to say that will remove all of them. You will always have some level of requirements, particularly in older organizations, more established organizations. So just tackle the ones that you think that you can have the most impact, show the value, and that starts to unlock some of the others.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you say about kind of the 20 years versus new to a company as well. I was having a conversation in a networking space at an event recently where we were talking about exactly that of, CDOs and data leaders. Is it better to be in an organization for a much longer time to really understand the business and the the journey that a business has been on as well? Or is it better to go into a new organization and change every, say, 5 years, so that you're coming in with a fresh perspective and perhaps looking at things a bit differently than you would if you... It's an ongoing, interesting discussion that I have noticed that people are having, and I'm glad that you could add kind of a bit of perspective on that, from that agility, that perhaps you're able to be more agile in a larger legacy company when you understand that journey and you've been part of that journey for a bit longer. And I think it's just, yeah, just a really interesting additional perspective on that. Now, we are quickly running out of time here today, Robin. So my last question for you is, we've covered quite a few stories, all under the banner of organization transformation. What's the one thing you want our audience to take away from today?
Yeah, I think just stay positive, I guess. A lot of transformation becomes very discouraging, right? I think particularly, like you said, and when you have sort of this ecosystem, even in new organizations, digital native organizations, I think the rate of growth of some of them is just phenomenal. And we're sort of seeing that come around the ecosystem. So just stay grounded in the fact that, yes, you're driving positive change, you're doing the right things for the organization, you're delivering better services, and ultimately, that's going to have an amazing impact on society. It can be relatively discouraging, I think, some days, where you just feel like you can't make any progress. People aren't listening, the stories aren't resonating, you're not connected to the right pieces of the business. And so I think as a data community, because we are data driven, we tend to focus on where the problems are and what we're going to fix. And so I've had to remind myself a couple of times over the last few months, like, be positive on the impact that we're making, and what a positive impact that's going to have for society as a whole.
Amazing. Well, Robin, thank you so much for joining me today on Data Story Time. It's been lovely chatting with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Catherine. I appreciate it.